Fighters based on fictional legends? Fight hard, Dueling Hearts. It was a little under 1 month after the encounter between Team Dueling Hearts and the 3 Soul Takers that something else noteworthy happened in the lives of those 4 heroic fighters. This time, though, the story isn't quite so harrowing. While the broad details are similar, it actually tells of one of the more enjoyable instances during that period of their lives. Enough time had passed that all 4 Dueling Hearts had completely recovered from their life-or-death struggle, and all of them had been given time to reflect and learn from their success and failure during that conflict. As a result, each of them had gotten even stronger, though it would be pretty crazy to try to quantify that increase in strength by citing some nebulous ranking, number, or percentage. On this particular day, they were out and about, all 4 of them together, walking deeper into the city than they usually did. They even had a temporary 5th person added to their entourage. In fact, he was the reason for their trek. "You know, Will," Joe insisted, "it's the 21st century. Now, when we break our refrigerators, we can have replacement parts, or even entire new fridges, delivered to us within, a day and a half. We certainly don't have to go to the warehouse ourselves to pick them up when they aren't in stock in town." "Is that the royal we?" Sarah asked her sister, "or is that we as in the 5 of us?" "Definitely both," Joe replied, sliding her hands beneath her tattered black overshirt and into the pockets of her faded jeans, her forward pace never faltering. "That's so," Sarah agreed, pushing her bouncy, curly blonde hair back over her shoulders. "I just don't know why all 4 of us had to come," Joe's best friend, the lanky, spiky-haired, red-headed Tucker, complained, his arms crossed annoyedly over his broad chest. He looked sideways to Joe's cousin, Jen, who was the next tallest of the 4 after himself, wearing black lipstick and clad in her usual goth attire, as if she might have an answer. Before she could say anything, though, Tucker preempted her with a yelp. He rubbed the back of his head and looked back over his shoulder at the 5th member of their group, the elderly Mr. Wilson, who was still holding aloft the sturdy wooden cane that had caused the minor injury. Wilson smiled, satisfied with his work, and then said to Joe, "I am well aware, Miss Seeger, that times have changed. In fact, they haven't changed nearly as much as you might think within my lifetime, but I prefer to handle things myself. I always have. And as to why I brought all of you along to keep me company, clearly it's because it would be unfair to ask any one of you over the others. I get the feeling," Sarah said under her breath to her sister, "that when he says unfair, he means something different than the rest of us." Joe laughed, and she laughed even harder when Wilson reached forward and rapped Sarah in the back of the head as well, saying, "I heard that." "It's not too bad," Jen said, adding her 2 cents to the conversation. "I was planning to walk for my exercise today anyway." Tucker harumphed. "Yeah, okay. I guess it's not awful." He looked around at the eclectic city structures that surrounded the group, from low rises to huge multi-story offices with towers, at the trees planted along the sides of the road, casting shade upon the party as they traveled, and at the diverse crowds through which they passed. "I mean, I don't get into the city very often. It is a nice change." It was clear that he was only trying to convince himself, but Wilson seemed satisfied. The group kept walking for another 20 minutes or so in relative silence, eventually coming to a less densely populated area of town. Rather than shop fronts and skyscrapers, the Dueling Hearts and their elderly tag-along found themselves surrounded by warehouses. One of them, the furthest across a large gravel lot, bore the logo of the appliance repair store that Wilson preferred. Joe looked around, scanning the area with her dark eyes. "You know," she thought, "this would make for a really great stage for a heart-to-heart." She imagined herself and her friends darting expertly throughout her surroundings, clashing good-naturedly with some faceless challengers. It wasn't a ridiculous idea. Ever since her team's victory a month and a half ago against a team of professional soul fighters, Team Beatdown, other pros had been approaching them looking to test their skills. It was just when Joe admitted to herself, reluctantly, that something like that wasn't going to happen that something like that happened. Out of nowhere, 4 figures surged into the lot and toward the 4 members of the Dueling Hearts, running low to the ground, poised to strike, moving too quickly to be seen clearly, appearing almost a little blurry. Immediately, the 4 Dueling Hearts stepped back and readied themselves to guard. Reflexively, they circled up around Wilson, who seemed to be the only one who was following the movements of the 4 assailants without effort. He also didn't seem at all concerned, an amused smirk playing at his lips as he watched with interest to see how his 4 young companions would handle the situation. The 4 assailants struck in unison, and the 4 Dueling Hearts reacted. Joe and Sarah managed to counter their attackers in a pair of single complex combinations, knocking them hard to the ground. Tucker ducked inside his opponent's guard, shouldered one of their strikes, and then punched them so hard in the chest that they were blasted away. Meanwhile, Jen executed a slightly less efficient takedown than her cousins. In each case, though, a good second after taking a solid hit, each of the attackers disappeared, popping like a bundle of balloons. Joe in particular was struck by this. They weren't real, she wondered. A month ago, the dangerous enemy that Joe had fought had the ability to manifest perfect duplicates of herself that she could use to hide the actual nature of her attacks. Those duplicates, though, had only been illusions, incapable of taking or delivering hits. This was something else, something that was, in its own way, even more dangerous. "Did you guys catch it?" Jen asked, stepping back into her ready stance. "They were all exactly the same, but they didn't look entirely real. Someone sent all of them and didn't particularly care if they were convincing." "They hit pretty hard," Tucker announced, rubbing his shoulder. "But they can't take a hit." "That's good," Sarah remarked flatly, with an exhausted sigh, "because there are more where those came from." The other 3 dueling hearts followed her gaze to the roofs of the nearby warehouses, just in time to see dozens of identical assailants leap down on them on bursts of air, launching themselves across the wide gap and right at the dueling hearts below. They looked just like the first 4 clones in every way, blonde, wearing khakis, black headbands, and orange sweatshirts with black shoulders. They also, like the first 4, looked just a little blurry, becoming more so the faster they moved. Their movements were a little robotic, too, just enough that they weren't convincing as real people, but those movements were effective enough that, when they made knife-throwing motions, spinning blade-like bursts of partially solid air flew forth from their hands. The dueling hearts steeled themselves up. This would be a difficult assault to repel, while also defending their elderly companion, and they knew it, but they held their ground anyway. They were understandably surprised, then, when Wilson stepped into the space between them and the incoming onslaught of attacks so calmly that it was disarming. "All right," Wilson announced. "That's enough." He raised his cane, holding it like a rapier, and swung it so hard that it created a wave of compressed air along its path, knocking the clones' attacks to the side, and then striking the clones themselves in the chest, causing all of them to pop violently like their predecessors. With a satisfied smile, Wilson planted the tip of his cane in the gravel at his feet and declared, "Now show yourselves, and let's get on with whatever this is." A voice, which sounded somewhere between intimidated and amused, rang throughout the gravel lot. "Whoa, yeah, okay." The source of that voice, a tall, muscular young man with messy black hair wearing a baggy orange and blue hoodie and sweats with the Japanese writing on the chest, thick blue armbands, and a thick blue belt, stepped out from the shadows of the building that the dueling hearts had been trying to reach. He held his hands up in a show of surrender, but a big, dumb grin split his face, making it clear that this situation excited him. "We just wanted to challenge you," the guy said, "and when we saw you heading this way, we thought that this would be a cool way to do it." "We?" Joe asked, stepping out of her favorite back stance and inserting her hands back into her pockets. "Obviously there are more of them," Jen remarked thoughtfully. "That dude doesn't look anything like the clones that attacked us." "We didn't know that the old guy with you was strong too," the black-haired guy said, "or else we would have been more direct. We never wanted a misunderstanding." He looked back at the shadow of the building and said, "Come on, if you guys keep hiding, I'm going to look like an idiot." "More of an idiot, you mean?" came another male voice. This one was less cheery, dripping with a sarcastic pride. Its source appeared from the darkness alongside his friend. He was shorter, but only by a couple inches, with hair that was just as dark, but slicked back stylishly. He wore a blue blazer, open in the front, over a white shirt and black slacks, and he smirked across the lot at the dueling hearts, fire in his eyes. "Leave him alone," came a third voice, this one every bit as excited as the first. As he spoke, he too emerged from the shadows, matching the appearance of the clones, making it clear that he had been their source. "You were the one who suggested that we surprise him in the first place, remember?" Behind this third figure, a fourth and final young man appeared. He was the only one of the group who didn't seem all too interested in what was happening. In fact, he looked pretty bored, though it was hard to see his expression very well at all from beneath the shadow cast upon him by the straw-colored fisherman's hat that he wore. His slim arms, left bare by his plain white tank top, hung limp at his sides, his thumbs hooked around the belt loops of the red cargo shorts that he was wearing. "Let's just get this over with," he insisted, turning toward the dueling hearts and calling out to them, speaking for his whole group. "So hey, do you want to have a proper heart-to-heart with us or not? Perhaps you should introduce yourselves first," Wilson suggested. He was still grinning, but Joe could sense a slight air of attention from him. The conflict between the dueling hearts and the soul takers had started similarly to this. It was clear that he was at least a little worried that this encounter was in some way like that one. Joe wasn't, though. She'd noticed something, an iron-on patch on the leg of Fishing Hat's pants, bearing a symbol that looked like it might be a Japanese kanji, or maybe a stylized J and S laid over top of each other. In fact, looking from him to his companions, she could see that each of the interlopers had an identical patch somewhere on their clothing, marking the 4 as a team of professional fighters. "It's okay, Will," she assured him. "These guys are just pros looking for a match." "She's right," the first speaker out of the 4 agreed. He motioned for his friends to follow and moved to stand nearer to the dueling heart. As if they had practiced it, the 4 of them lined up with him and the clone guy in the middle. He opened his mouth to introduce the 4 of them properly, but Tucker cut him off, shouting, "Wait, I know you guys." "Oh, I see that our reputation precedes us," the one with the slicked hair remarked. Joe looked them over again, one by one, paying close attention to their outfits and their features, and the symbol on their patches, and she was surprised to realize that she and her friend were on the same page. "I recognize you guys too," Joe announced. "What did you guys call yourselves? Team Superfans or something like that?" The spiky-haired guy chuckled. "We originally called ourselves Team Fanboy," he admitted. "That sounded too much like something out of somebody's poorly planned, nebulously canon spin-off story to be taken seriously. So instead we came up with a better name to go along with our gimmick." "Gimmick?" Sarah asked, barely paying attention at this point, while she waited for a confirmation as to whether or not she was going to have to hit anything else. "That's right," Tucker gasped, grinning stupidly. "You're one of those teams, the ones that model themselves after characters from martial arts shows." "Yeah," Joe agreed. It was all coming back to her now. Even after Soul appeared 30 years ago, and the world had become like an anime, people hadn't stopped having ideas for stories to tell about other worlds where people had superpowers of their own. Worlds where people got their superpowers from martial arts, or where they used those powers to strengthen their martial arts, were more popular now than ever. So people with soul powers and techniques resembling the abilities of characters in those stories sometimes modeled themselves after those characters to stand out more. Most of them were terrible, but there was one team which had proven itself again and again to be good enough to go pro. "Right on the money," the spiky-haired guy said. "You can think of us as the legally distinct stand-ins for all of your favorite fight anime protagonists. I'm Joseph, and these are my teammates, Donald, Nathan, and Ken." He gestured to the slick-haired guy, the clone guy, and the board guy in turn. "You can call us Team Shonen." There was a dramatic pause, and then Jen spoke up, a thoughtful edge finding its way into her voice as she said, "I like it. It works on a couple of different levels." "Thanks," Joseph replied. "We put a lot of thought into it. Now what do you guys say? Do you want to take us on or not?" The Dueling Hearts shared a look of agreement and then answered, "Yeah, we do." They were presented with a couple of problems, though. First of all, it wasn't exactly up to them what they did with their time, since they had agreed to help Wilson. The old man, however, thought of himself as their teacher, and so was perfectly content with the four of them engaging in a competition that would help them grow, as long as they finished relatively quickly. Their second problem was a little more difficult to solve, but not by much. Team Shonen had, technically, broken the law by attacking the way they had in a public area. In order for them to continue with their fight without the risk of facing charges, they needed to make way to one of the areas set aside by the city for heart-to-hearts to happen. Luckily, the only real difficulty there was the time it took for them to reach such a location. A local park with 4 different sections that were designed as heart-to-heart safe zones, each with different conditions. The walk wasn't hard, but it did put the time limit on their match to almost exactly 1 hour. "Since we're pressed for time," Wilson told all 8 fighters as they arrived, "you should pair off, choose different areas of the park, and all fight at the same time. I trust all of you to keep track of your own defeats, though I will be keeping an eye on your matches just in case." He walked off toward the center of the park, and the others weren't sure how he intended to watch every one of their fights at once, but they didn't really care either. Joseph shared a look with his teammates, and the 4 of them ran off in different directions. "All right," Joe told the other Dueling Hearts. "Looks like we're starting. Pick an opponent and head out. It doesn't matter who you pick, except that Joseph guy is mine." The air became heavy with static. Bolts of energy crackled down along Joe's legs, and without another word, without even waiting for her friends to respond, she disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a trail of purple lightning at her heels. "Dibs on the dude with all the clones," Jen announced, and she ran off after Nathan. "I didn't even see which one went which way," Sarah remarked before running blindly after Donald. "Yeah, fine," Tucker relented, kicking himself for acting too slowly to get a choice, as he charged off after the final member of the opposing team, the unexcited Ken. Tucker considered himself to be pretty fast, especially for someone who didn't have a step technique like Joe's to move himself over long distances, but even running all out, he never caught up with his opponent before reaching their fight stage. It was a dynamic location, consisting of a large man-made lake with concrete platforms spaced throughout it, surrounded by a large circle of complex brickwork and some attractive, well-cut green grass. By the time Tucker arrived, Ken was waiting for him, standing atop a dark-colored metal fountain in the center of the lake, his arms crossed. Tucker skid to a stop, facing off with his opponent. Immediately, the air between the 2 fighters became charged with their clashing energies, signaling to both of them that the fight had already started. Tucker smiled wide and sent his soul down past the bottoms of his feet, creating a burst of heat and light which launched him upward toward his opponent's perch like a missile. He drew back his right fist, moving some soul into it as well, strengthening it considerably, prepared to strike. Despite this, Ken remained completely unconcerned, and for good reason. Moments before Tucker's attack would have connected, Ken reacted. Tucker felt energy surge through his opponent's body as he reached behind his back. To Tucker's amazement, Ken's arm extended, stretching a good 30 feet. Then it retracted like a rubber band, snapping forward, the flesh over his hand and knuckles turning rigid and metallic gray before slamming into Tucker's face. He felt like he'd been hit by a bus, a condition that he, unfortunately, had more experience with than one might immediately expect. His forward momentum was cancelled instantly, and he was knocked back into the water beneath him with a gigantic splash. Aiming to end this fight quickly, Ken sent more soul into his legs, and they compressed beneath him, decompressing a moment later, launching him skyward. He fell in an arc, driving his right heel down into the place where Tucker had fallen. His foot, under his sandal, likewise turned metallic-colored, but before his attack could connect, Tucker lunged out of the water and onto one of the little concrete islands, avoiding the strike by the skin of his teeth. He turned in place and found his footing, facing off with his opponent again, just as the last of the water settled back into place. "Interesting," Tucker remarked with a smile. "I've never seen somebody with a power like that before." He reached up and wiped a trickle of blood from his lips. It was the only injury that he had sustained, despite the force of the hit that he'd taken. "You like it?" Ken asked, though he didn't really sound interested in the answer. "It's fine, I guess. I'm kind of bouncy by default, but I can control how rigid my body is pretty freely. It lets me hit hard and move around really easily, and I don't take much damage at all from physical attacks. And it's why I'm on this team. They heard about me and sought me out because those powers resemble some characters. I never wanted to be on a themed team, but it was a chance to go pro, so I took it." He looked Tucker up and down. "And I guess this is turning out to be a more interesting fight than I expected. Not many people could take a hit from me and get right back up like that. This could be more fun than I thought." "That's the spirit." The two fighters launched themselves back, ending up on opposite sides of the lake, their eyes locked. Tucker willed his soul to mix with the life energy at the core of his being, generating more of both, empowering himself. He felt his opponent doing the same. The ground rumbled beneath their feet, and they surged forward, renewing their clash. Sarah never once lost sight of her opponent, who she was able to identify before long from the gleam of his hair gel. She wondered for a moment what his abilities might be. She felt like she recognized the character that he was modeled after, but she couldn't dredge up any specifics. With an annoyed grumble, she sent some of her soul into her legs and launched herself after him at double speed. She reached him in an instant, but he saw her coming, scrambling behind a nearby structure. Realizing that they had come to their fighting stage, Sarah looked around and took stock. The ground beneath her feet was covered in rubber turf. The center of the space was taken up by a large wooden playset, which was surrounded by several smaller wooden structures, each bearing the instructions for a specific exercise. Donald had ducked behind one of these latter structures, a wooden wall beside a balance beam. "If he thinks he's safe back there," Sarah thought, "he is wrong. I can jump that easily and surprise him." She willed her soul and her life energy to mix, sending another surge of soul into her legs. She wound up to jump, but before she could, Donald ducked around the side of the wooden wall and pointed a finger gun at her. She almost laughed until she felt his energies stirring as well, and raw soul built at the tip of his finger, firing off at her in the form of a narrow beam. She repurposed her jump, launching herself to the side, avoiding the blast. It hit another of the exercise structures behind her, this one much larger than the first, and blasted it apart completely. Sarah looked her opponent over again as he ran from his place behind the wooden wall and over to the larger playset itself, ducking into the shadow beneath it. He had seemed so unassuming, like someone who was undeserving of the confidence that he displayed, but now it was clear that he had some serious power justifying his attitude. Sarah had to watch out. Her opponent's blasts made him dangerous at a distance, so her best option was to get in close. Of course, until she could, she needed a ranged option that would allow her to counter him. Thankfully, she had one that would also help her to catch her opponent off guard and close the distance between them. With a thought, she sent a wave of her soul out into the air around her, and the air grew heavy and humid. Moisture in the environment was drawn to her, pooling in the air above her head. She clenched her left fist, and half of that water condensed down into floating chunks of ice. Then, with a gesture, the remaining water shot off in a pressurized stream that curved beneath the playset, threatening to knock Donald on his ass. Seeing the attack coming, Donald dodged it by retreating from his hiding place. Recognizing that doing so left him exposed, as he did so, he once again aimed his finger gun at Sarah even as he moved. He was shocked, though, when he realized that she had anticipated this. The moment that he emerged, she sent her chunks of ice to bear down on him. This wasn't an attack that Donald was incapable of dealing with, however. There were too many ice chunks spread too far apart for him to deflect them all with the same kind of blast that he'd used before. So he sent that energy into his hand, squeezing it, sending it spraying out through the spaces between his fingers, like the blast of a shotgun. It didn't travel very far, but it did its job. Sarah's ice was shattered, leaving behind a curtain of glimmering mist that hung between the two fighters. Meanwhile, Jen pursued her opponent into the third area of the park. It was a dense wooded area interspersed with walking paths. It wasn't long after they crossed the tree line that Jen's opponent, Nathan, passed behind one of the trees and seemed to disappear. Jen extended her senses upon an invisible, unconcentrated wave of her soul. She couldn't hear her opponent moving, and she couldn't sense his energies pushing back against hers. Even his life energy had disappeared. Was this some kind of power he possessed? Could he suppress both of his energies, entering into some kind of stealth mode? If he could, then a dense area like this was his ideal battleground. It took Jen less than a second to determine what her opponent likely planned to do, that he was probably behind that same tree, or a tree near to it, waiting to ambush her. She couldn't just run past wherever it was that he was hiding. She had to try and get him to overextend, so she stopped running and rededicated herself to locating him. That's when Jen realized her mistake. She felt a sudden movement of the air behind her, and she turned just in time to repel her opponent's thrusting fist. He had never expected her to fall into an ambush, and so he had set a more complex trap. Somehow, while hidden, he had managed to get behind her and into her blind spot. She ducked beneath his follow-up strike, sidestepping a third, and countered, scoring a solid hit upon the center of his chest. He was knocked back, but as he fell away from her, Jen was able to get a look at all of him at once. She realized that she'd allowed herself to be caught off guard by him for a third time already. As soon as the realization struck, the clone of Nathan popped and dispersed in a puff of wind. Jen felt additional movement all around her and looked around, finding herself completely surrounded by another dozen clones, all mid-attack. Her strength had never been hand-to-hand combat, but that was why she'd gone after Nathan in the first place. Who better to push herself against than someone who could attack so effectively from multiple directions all at the same time? So Jen embraced this challenge. She sent her soul throughout her body, activating the special trait of her gravity soul which wrapped her in a veil of soft purple light, lowering her personal gravity. Now she could move significantly faster and more freely, even if she wasn't able to put as much weight behind her strikes anymore. With effort, this advantage allowed Jen to maneuver around the attacks of each of the clones in turn. As she did, she wove symbols in the air with her fingers, creating two small glowing sigils out of her soul which flashed and folded into softball-sized purple orbs that she snatched out of the air. She leapt back, getting the clones to follow her, and then threw her orbs at two of the clones furthest to the outside of their formation. They stuck to their targets, unfurling again into the little sigils. Those sigils were drawn to each other, pulling the clones along with them. 3/4 of the clones were caught between them, slamming into each other, popping a moment later, leaving Jen with only 3 opponents left to worry about. She sent more soul into her hands, creating another 2 orbs that she tossed at the 2 clones nearest to her. Their bodies became suddenly heavier and they fell back as Jen met the third in close quarters combat. She defeated that clone just as easily as the one she'd faced at the warehouse, and then moved on to the final 2, punching one in the chest while she wove another of the small sigils with her offhand. She turned to the final clone just as it recovered from the change to its personal gravity and renewed its advance. Her latest sigil took on orb form, and Jen threw it at her opponent. But it had seen her throw enough orbs by now that it knew to dodge, letting the latest orb fly harmlessly over its shoulder. Meanwhile, Jen was hit, taking a fierce punch directly to her side. It was the kind of hit that could take a lesser fighter out of a heart-to-heart all at once, but Jen, after a gasp, only smiled. It was clear in that moment that Jen had meant to take that hit. She'd taken a page out of Tucker's book, letting her guard down, drawing her opponent in close enough to touch it on its abdomen. The thrown orb struck a tree several yards away, unfurling like a flower, forming the little sigil once again, just as Jen sent more of her own soul into her opponent. That final clone and the tree behind it were drawn to each other, and the tree was rooted more firmly than the clone was. It flew toward the tree, slamming into it hard enough to be destroyed. Jen was relieved, but she didn't let herself rest. She knew it was coming next, even if she didn't know where it would come from. She readied herself, and sure enough, her true opponent, Nathan, the source of the clones, seemed to flicker into her line of sight, appearing out of nowhere, keeping low, striking quickly and carefully. Jen tried to defend, knocking her opponent's first few strikes away, but finding herself overwhelmed in no time. She was struck again in the ribs, once on each side, and then right in the center of her chest in her celiac plexus. The wind flew from her lungs, and she sailed back, crashing hard into the ground. Taking the opportunity to finish his opponent while she was helpless, Nathan leapt up into the air above her. He made some complex signs with his hands, weaving his energies into a deliberate pattern, just as Jen did with her sigils, and then swiped downward at Jen with his entire right arm. A wave of compressed air, similar to the one that Wilson had created earlier, poured downward toward her with the force of a dozen of Nathan's punches all at once. Taking a hit like that would leave her unable to fight for sure. Jen had no choice but to move, so despite the damage that she'd taken, and her desperate, ongoing attempt to reclaim the breath that she'd lost, that's exactly what she did. Jo followed behind Joseph with purpose. She wasn't great at using her senses to tell where someone was, let alone how strong they were, and yet she could sense that this fighter was powerful. It was possible that he was even on par with the 2 most powerful people Jo had ever fought, which was a possibility that excited her greatly. Jo was always looking for opportunities to test herself and improve her skills. Going against someone this strong was exactly that kind of opportunity, and so she refused to let it pass her by. She had hoped to get an early leg up on her opponent by using her signature technique, the shadow step, to close the gap between them. With it, as long as Joe was standing within a shadow, she could move at many times her normal speed in bursts proportional to the shadow's length. She couldn't actually attack while moving using the shadow step, but she could change her stance to get ready for attacks. And while she had encountered many opponents who could follow her movements in that state, she had never met anyone who could outright outrun her. Despite this, she did not catch up with Joseph, instead finding him waiting for her in the fourth section of the park, standing upon green grass among several raised hills and rocky outcroppings, his arms crossed defiantly. "You know," Joseph told Joe, "I really envy you. That guy you beat, Christopher Johnson, he was like an unscalable wall in the regional pro circuit. Everyone wanted to be the one to tear that wall down. I wanted to be the one to tear that wall down. I trained for a long time to do it, but you were the one who got that chance. I'm actually kind of upset. Not enough to be, out for revenge or something, but still, I am a little nettled. That's why I came here looking for a heart-to-heart today. I want to beat you and prove that I could have done what you did, or at the very least confirm that it wasn't some fluke." Joe smiled. It was as good a reason to want to fight her as any, and knowing that her opponent had some entirely innocent yet justified personal vendetta against her, as if they were fated rivals or something, got her heart beating even faster. "Then confirm away," she told her opponent, and, drawing upon her own shadow this time, she shadow-stepped again right at her foe, poised to hit him with everything she had. Joseph moved to meet her assault, and Joe was utterly shocked to see that his movements were almost as fast as her own. The air around him seemed to compress in on him and then decompress, assisting with his movements. In short, he had his own step technique, and that was something that Joe had never encountered before. Refusing to be caught off guard, Joe changed things up, darting quickly around her opponent, appearing behind him, aiming a strike backed by all of her momentum at his back. He either saw or sensed the attack coming, though, and turned just in time to guard against it, putting as much soul as he could muster into his arm, blocking the strike outright to Joe's surprise. She attacked again, shadow-stepping tiny distances, allowing her to change her stance in an instant without telegraphing her movements at all. But her opponent was able to read them anyway, guarding against each one in turn. Joe couldn't believe what she was seeing. Christopher Johnson hadn't been able to follow and counter her attacks this well. Her most recent opponent, the Soul Taker, Karen, hadn't been able to react so quickly to Joe's attacks without studying her movements first. This guy's speed was on a whole other level, but it didn't come without a cost. As the two of them regrouped, putting some distance between each other, Joe noticed that her opponent was sweating and breathing far more heavily than he should have been. That's how he's keeping up, Joe realized. He's been straining to stay ahead, with no regard for his own stamina. His strategy put me off guard for a minute there, but that doesn't matter anymore. Just so long as I don't act too reckless, I win. She was sure that she had her opponent figured out, so much so that she began to relax. This proved to be a mistake, as it was at that very moment that Joseph revealed a secret that changed the flow of their heart-to-heart in an instant. With the veil of mist hanging in the air, Sarah couldn't see her opponent, but that could prove to be an opportunity. She willed her soul to mix with the life energy at her core, amplifying them both for a few seconds, sending her extra life energy out from her body like a sonar blast. With it, she could perceive clearly where Donald was behind that mist and lunged toward him, hoping to use his relative blindness to her advantage. What Sarah didn't count on was that Donald could use his energies in a similar way. He had to wait until Sarah moved to perceive accurately where she was, but in the fraction of a second that it took her to pierce the cloud of ice between them, water summoned from the air condensing down and wrapping around her hand, forming a set of icy, brass knuckles, her fist raised to strike. He was able to prepare himself. He took aim with his finger gun, guessing where, specifically, Sarah would be when she emerged, and fired off another beam. As stunned, Sarah was hit with the full force of the blast and sent flying. She crashed into the springy ground with so much force that she tore a trench right through it, and several yards of hard ground beneath it. Donald smiled. He'd done it. He'd beaten one of the up-and-coming dueling hearts, and it hadn't even been much more difficult than he'd expected. A grin clinging to his lips, he swaggered over to where his opponent had fallen to admire his handiwork. Jen threw herself, with effort, up and away from the ground, turning on her hand and vaulting well clear of Nathan's attack. With a final deep breath, she collected herself and recovered from the last hit that she'd taken. By now, though, Nathan had fallen back to the ground and was pressing his advantage. He struck quickly and fiercely, and it took everything that Jen had to deflect even a third of his strikes. She was hit, and bad, getting knocked around before having her feet swept out from beneath her. Then, as she fell, Nathan thrust his palm at her abdomen. A violently swirling orb of condensed air formed in that palm, expanding outward, sending Jen flying clear through one of the nearby trees. The halo of soft purple soul that had surrounded Jen up to this point flickered and faded as she moaned in pain. Meanwhile, Nathan stood back and waited. This wasn't technically an official heart-to-heart, but there was no point in trying to hit Jen while she was down if there was a chance that she already couldn't get up and keep fighting. He was visibly impressed when, despite everything, Jen did manage to struggle her way back to uncertain footing, the last wisps of a golden aura clinging to her form. With a grin on his face, he readied himself to rush Jen again, but that's when Jen played her hand. With a grin of her own, she gestured, and Nathan stumbled. He found his arms and legs wrapped in the soft purple light of Jen's soul, but rather than lower his weight, the soul increased it. This was a technique that Jen had used before, passing some of her soul into her opponent and then activating it later, limiting their movements and bringing them down nearer to her own level of physical performance. In spite of her lingering injuries, Jen took advantage of the confusion that her technique had caused, launching an immediate attack. She surged forward, driving a devastating knee strike into her opponent's sternum. At the moment of impact, her halo of soul appeared around her again, increasing her weight this time and spreading it into her opponent, canceling the soul that was weighing him down. Nathan was sent flying further than Jen had been. He landed hard, sprawled out on his back. Stunned, it took Nathan a full second to realize what had happened. When he did, he smiled and laughed, thrilled by how much of a challenge Jen was proving to be. After taking another moment to collect himself, he moved to stand. But he discovered that he couldn't. He was surprised to find that the roots of 2 nearby trees had extended out of the ground and grown over his torso, trapping him. "What do you think?" Jen asked, standing above Nathan, tracing a shape in the ground with her foot. "It's not a technique I get to use often, since I don't fight in wooded areas much, but I can send my soul into plants, making them more durable and mixing with their life energy, causing them to grow fast." "Hey man," Nathan replied, "from everything I've heard about how clever you can be, I believe it." His smile returned to his face, and he wrestled his hands up to his chest, gesturing with both of them together. Instantly he disappeared, replaced by a large branch from somewhere nearby, pulled from the forest floor. He had traded places with it, leaving Jen, once again, with absolutely no idea where he might be. So Jen listened, hoping to locate her opponent before he could launch another sneak attack. Technically, she did succeed, hearing his footsteps behind her, but by the time she did, he was already upon her, poised to strike. She didn't have time to defend, but thankfully she didn't have to. Instead, Jen finished tracing a complex sigil circle, about the size of a car tire, in the dirt at her feet. It glowed with the soft purple of her soul, and expanded to surround both fighters. Nathan felt as if he were holding up a skyscraper on his back. He dropped to his knees while Jen, draped in the veil of her soul, was unaffected. She willed her soul and her life energy to mix, increasing her strength in one huge burst. And she turned to face her opponent, poised for a finishing attack. Ken and Tucker traded blow after blow in rapid succession. They each did their best to avoid hits when they could, but neither of them succeeded in stopping every attack from their opponent. Ken in particular had an advantage. His arms could weave more easily around Tucker's guard, and there was a springiness to those arms which added more force to his punches, even when he didn't make his fingers more rigid. Meanwhile, Tucker could confirm what Ken had claimed earlier. He really didn't take much damage from physical attacks. Whenever Tucker did land a punch, his hands just bounced back. He was having to fight against this recoil, wearing himself down further, faster. This was how Tucker tended to fight best, though, using his great endurance and his stubborn persistence to take his opponent's attacks long enough to get in close and deliver a decisive blow. He was surprised, then, to find that he was being overwhelmed. He had landed such blows multiple times now. He drove a knee into his opponent's side, but it bounced off. He got behind his opponent long enough to hit him in the back of the neck, but his opponent just shrugged it off the way that Tucker himself was able to shrug off lesser blows. Wondering what to do, what he could do, he hesitated, giving his opponent an opening wide enough to get off a finishing move of his own. Ken shifted back a step, and he lifted his right leg up high. His leg stretched until his foot was close to 50 feet high, snapping downward like a guillotine blade toward the top of Tucker's head, his heel gleaming like a steel mallet. Tucker saw the attack coming, and he raised his guard, crossing his arms in the path of Ken's attack, but it barely mattered. His knees buckled beneath him. The ground below him broke and compressed. He coughed as dust and debris invaded his lungs, recoiling his left arm, which was broken. Ken stepped back. He looked at Tucker, dumbfounded, as Tucker stumbled back to his feet. Ken was surprised that his opponent was still upright. His opponents didn't tend to stay up after an attack like that. Wanting to end things quickly, before Tucker could muscle his way through more of his techniques, Ken stepped back and repeated the first attack that he had made against Tucker. His fist snapped into Tucker's jaw, sending him tumbling away violently. Ken let out a sigh of relief, thinking that that was the end, only for Tucker to surprise him all over again. Broken, bloody, and battered, Tucker stumbled out of the dirt on shaking legs. "Man, you're annoying," he told Ken. Ken frowned. "I was going to say the same thing about you. Want to do me a favor and just pass out?" "No way," Tucker replied with a chuckle. "I'm just getting started." He willed his soul and his life energy to mix, creating a gleaming golden healing life energy aura around himself. Before Ken's eyes, Tucker's broken arm straightened out, the bone knitting back together, and the various bruises and cuts visible across his body faded at least almost all the way. Then, with a clench of his fist, Tucker willed his energies to mix again. Energy crackled between Tucker and his opponent as his healing aura faded and was replaced by a hot, red aura of soul that resembled flames. "Alright, fine," Ken relented. He focused his own energies, sending crackling waves of soul throughout and along his body, and the shape of his body changed. His muscles bulged and his body expanded until he was more than twice his original height, with legs roughly the same size, but an upper body that even a bodybuilder would be jealous of. An aura formed that swirled around him and clung to him like steam, and with a flex, he willed the flesh of his arms and legs to harden, turning them black as iron. Tucker had seen something like this before. It resembled one of the abilities that James of Team Beatdown possessed. James had been slow and cumbersome in this form, though, while the unique properties of Ken's soul and their effect on him would naturally offset such a disadvantage. In fact, even now, he stood on his toe tips, as if his body were eager to bounce away. The moment that Tucker was able to reason this out, Ken proved his suspicions to be true. He compressed his legs and launched himself at Tucker, driving a ham-sized fist downward in a devastating arch. Despite how much stronger this form made Ken, though, Tucker's aura was even more potent of a power-up. He caught Ken's fist in one hand and, with a smile, sent Ken flying with an uppercut to the jaw. Joe watched, amazed, as Joseph removed the thick armbands that he wore, as well as the thick belt from around his waist, and dropped them on the ground in dramatic fashion. They fell with enough force that they actually cracked the dirt. "Holy crap," Joe explained. "How heavy are those things?" "Heavy enough," Joseph replied with a cheeky grin, "to not only slow me down and make my fights more interesting, but also train my body every moment I wear them. By removing them, I free up my movements." He disappeared, moving too quickly for Joe to follow, appearing right behind her, "making myself more than twice as fast as I was before." Joe swiveled in place, but before she could raise her guard, Joseph drove an aerial back kick right into her chest, sending her flying. She managed to stay on her feet, sliding to a stop several yards away from where she'd started, but she was still put off balance, unable to react in time when Joseph appeared right in her face and pressed his attack, sweeping her legs out from under her and then driving her downward into the dirt with an elbow to the back. Joe struggled to rise, but before she could get far, Joseph kicked her up into the air, jumped up, and punched her back down toward the ground, this time with enough force that her impact left a crater. Joe was stunned. The heart-to-heart had turned around so quickly that it was giving her whiplash. She wasn't finished fighting, though. She wasn't too hurt to continue, and the gap between herself and Joseph wasn't so wide that she was completely outclassed. So, as Joseph dropped back to the ground at her side, she took action, digging her toes into the ground, into the shadow of her own leg, and shadow-stepped at her opponent. In an instant, she was upright again, in a proper stance, and poised to strike. She swung her fist in a downward arch toward her opponent's face. It took him everything he had to raise his guard in time to stop her, but he did stop her. Frustrated, Joe redoubled her efforts. She put as much energy as she could muster in that short instant into her shadow step, darting around her opponent, changing directions suddenly while she was in his peripheral vision. Joseph reacted, turning and launching a powerful kick at the side of Joe's head during what he thought was a moment of vulnerability, but his foot passed right through her. She faded from his vision, and he realized what she'd done, that she'd created a lingering image of herself in his eye long enough to draw his attention. He turned on his heel, but this time it was Joe who had managed to catch him off guard, appearing behind him just as he had appeared behind her earlier. Before he could raise his guard, she drove her knee, backed by the remaining momentum of her shadow step, into his gut. He was pushed back, but he refused to let Joe press what small advantage she had won. Even before recovering his footing, Joseph punched swiftly in Joe's direction again and again, so quickly that his arms were a blur, sending Soul down past his hands with each motion. Every one of his strikes created a shockwave about as potent as one of his punches, and before Joe even realized what her opponent was doing, dozens of those shockwaves were already upon her. Joe tried to defend, reaching out with soul-charged hands, swiping at each blast one after another, canceling them out, but she had reacted too slowly. She missed one and was hit in the obliques, knocking her off balance, and the remaining attacks found their marks, knocking her around. She cried out as her legs collapsed beneath her, and she fell onto her back, breathing heavily, unsure of whether she could move. Joseph slid to a stop and shored up his footing. "Hey," he called out across the distance between himself and his opponent. "Are you still conscious?" "Yeah," Joe replied, picking herself up carefully. Damn, Joseph replied. You're resilient. I mean, I watched your fight with Christopher, and you definitely got up when I didn't expect you to back then. But for some reason I thought it'd be different from me. Joe nodded. I feel that. She took a deep breath, flinching when pain shot through the left side of her torso. Her ribs were cracked at the very least. You are definitely stronger than me, though, she told Joseph. And you're almost as fast as I am, even when I'm using my shadow step technique. If I don't stop holding back, you'll win in our next exchange. And if you stop holding back, Joseph replied, and I don't, you'll bulldoze right over me. And I guess we should start taking this seriously. Joseph grinned. I guess so. Still tumbling through the air thanks to Tucker's attack, Ken grimaced. He extended his arms downward, dug his fingers into the ground, and pulled himself back out of the air, landing gently. He collapsed his fist into his oversized arm, like a spring-loaded piston, just as the fiery dueling heart lunged at him, looking to press his advantage. Then, as Tucker bore down on him, he sent even more soul into his fist, causing it to swell even larger until it could only be described as cartoonish. It snapped violently forward to meet Tucker head-on. Rather than dodge or guard, Tucker raised his fist as well. Flames wrapped his hand, and he threw a punch of his own, intercepting his opponent's comically overpowered strike. He felt the bones in his fingers strain, and his arm was knocked back so hard that his shoulder nearly popped from its socket, but he did manage to knock his opponent's fist away. It sprang back to its normal buffed-up size, leaving the fighter behind it wide open. Tucker didn't hesitate to take advantage of that opening either. He turned his aura away from him, launching himself forward like a man-shaped missile, and he drove a knee strike so powerful that it could have crumpled a tank into the center of his opponent's chest. Resistant to physical damage or not, the air was thrown from Ken's lungs, and he was knocked up into the air again. Tucker sent his aura downward this time, launching himself high into the air above his opponent, and then sent it upward, launching himself back down. He tackled his opponent into the ground so hard that the water in the nearby man-made lake erupted skyward. Finally, Tucker kicked off his opponent's chest, using it like a trampoline, jumping high up and away. As he hung in the air, he aimed his palms at the fallen Ken and sent his soul into the air between them. That air caught fire, and the flames swept over Ken, curling back on him, obscuring him from view for the long few seconds that it took Tucker to fall back to the ground. He dropped, exhausted, to one knee, his aura collapsing around him. He was spent, unable to fight on, but it didn't matter. When his flames dispersed, Ken, in his original form again, lay unconscious in the scorched dirt. The ground beneath Jen and her opponent began to rumble, knocking her off balance before she could deliver the kick that would have finished their fight. She stumbled back, out of the radius of her full-gravity sigil, and raised her guard, watching dumbfounded as Nathan's body began to burn with wisps of superheated air, and soul glowing a deep red. It wasn't exactly an aura, more resembling the halo of soul that Jen sometimes surrounded herself with, but this wasn't merely a means to better apply the effects of Nathan's own soul to his body. This was a strength-enhancing technique, like an aura but less powerful, and yet it still gave Nathan the strength to rise up and stomp the ground beneath his feet, cracking the dirt, destroying Jen's sigil in the process. Nathan met Jen's eyes. He grinned, and though this grin was no different from his others, the red light cast upon him gave his expression a sinister quality. Wind built beneath his feet and launched him toward Jen, poised to strike. He shaped the air and soul around his hands into claws and lashed out at Jen with both. Reacting more on instinct than anything else, Jen wrapped herself in soul once again, making herself lighter and more maneuverable as she moved evasively. She received several shallow cuts, but avoided the worst of her opponent's attacks. Finally, once Nathan seemed to be losing a bit of steam, Jen bent her knees and launched herself upward with all of her strength. She sailed high into the air, among the branches of the surrounding trees, and fell far more slowly than she should have. She traced small sigils in the air again, and another soft purple orb appeared in each of her hands. She tossed them both, putting a curve on them. One hit a tree to Nathan's right, and the other struck a glancing blow against his right shoulder. Before Nathan could react, the orbs unfurled into Jen's micro-sigils, and he was yanked to the side, slamming into the tree with enough force to crack it. Even as Nathan flew through the air, Jen traced 2 more sigils in the air, creating 2 more orbs. She tossed one of them at Nathan's forehead, then punched the other out of the air. Her right fist was yanked towards her opponent's face. She was pulled out of the air, slamming into him hard enough to break the first 2 sigils and send him tumbling away. Still protected by her halo of soul, Jen crashed into the ground, but bounced, flipping over and onto her feet. She watched as the halo of soul that surrounded Nathan faded, indicating that he was no longer conscious to maintain it. Jen shed her own soul, returning to her normal weight. She let out a sigh of relief. Nathan was incredibly strong, far more so than Jen herself, and yet she had still managed to win. Donald had barely taken a single step before his sense of victory was shattered. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. The trees at the edges of their fighting stage, the shrubs and the grass growing far beneath them, and even the ground itself began to shimmer with golden light. That light flowed in waves along the ground and into the crater made by Sarah's fall, and Donald watched, amazed, as Sarah stood up again. Her clothes were tattered, and she had blood spotting on her face and arms, but beneath that tattering and that spotting, she was completely uninjured. As the golden light stopped flowing, Sarah was surrounded by a halo of that same light. She met Donald's eyes and declared, "Life from the earth." You used a technique to heal," Donald reasoned, "but you shouldn't have been able to. You should have been knocked out by my blast before you could." Sarah didn't reply, but she did explain, holding up her right hand, the one that had been surrounded by her icy knuckles. The last chunk of her weapon fell away from her scorched hand. It wasn't hard for Donald to reason out that she had, at the very last moment, put her weapon in the path of his blast, cushioning her just enough to stay in the game. With a grimace, Donald aimed his finger gun at Sarah again. He fired, but even though Sarah waited until a fraction of a second before the blast would have hit her, she did move, and she did so quickly that Donald couldn't follow her initial movement. He stepped back and raised his guard just in time for Sarah to flicker into view in front of him, turning on her heel, driving her fist, backed by the momentum of her turn, upward into Donald's jaw. He wasn't able to brace himself well enough, and Sarah broke through his defenses easily, knocking him off balance. As he stumbled, Sarah shifted from heel to toe, from foot to foot, turning in tight circles, building up more momentum before driving her little knee into the center of her opponent's chest. Donald was sent flying, crashing into the very same wooden wall that he had used for cover at the start of their match, denting it. With a yelp, he fell heavily to the ground, rolled over onto his back, and said, "Yeah, okay, I give up." Without another word, Jo and her opponent willed their energies to mix, holding them together for as long as they could stand, increasing their available pools of soul by as much as their current training would allow. It was a painful process, but the results were undeniable. The ground shook so violently that the local news reported it as an earthquake, and it kept shaking as they allowed their soul to extend past their bodies and envelop them. Suddenly, Joseph was surrounded by a chaotic, colorless aura of churning, crackling air that blew his hair and his clothes around dramatically. Jo's aura, though, was even more impressive. It was in this area that Jo had the greatest advantage over most others. Her soul was an unnatural type soul, a soul with power over forces not found in nature, and it was a particularly impressive one at that. Having an unnatural soul limited Jo in certain ways, but it also made her soul, and any auras created from it, much more potent than average. The violent purple and black aura that surrounded her now was massive, and it more than made up for the difference in hers and her opponent's base levels of strength. The two fighters lunged at each other and traded a dozen blows before an observer could have blinked. Jo crackled with purple static, shadow-stepping rapidly and with purpose, attacking her opponent from multiple directions at virtually the same time. But Joseph, aided by the air, was able to step fast enough to keep up with her. He blocked her attacks and countered at every chance. His attacks didn't land either, though, as Jo was able to duck and weave around them. She shuffled back, sending her aura into her legs before shadow-stepping again, boosting her speed even further as she circled Joseph so quickly that he lost track of where she was. She saw this and ended her shadow step, aiming to drive her knee into her opponent's side, but he anticipated her attack. A moment before it could connect, he used his air step to launch himself high above her. It took Jo a full, long second to realize what her opponent had done. She looked up, scanning the sky, trying to locate him, but as she did, Joseph used his air step again, kicking off of the air itself, launching himself over her head and out of her line of sight. Like Jen often did, he fell far more slowly than he should have, twisting his torso enough that he could cup his hands together at his side, like he was holding a basketball there. He sent massive quantities of soul into the space between his two hands, packing it down into a single point. The air within that space was supercharged by that soul, rolling in upon itself, spinning so rapidly that the atmosphere around Joseph stirred, the clouds in the sky beginning to circle above his head. Jo felt this huge concentration of energy, and she turned in place, her eyes falling instantly upon her foe. She recognized what he was doing, and how potent his attack would be. Avoiding it within the designated space would be impossible. That left Jo with only one option. She had to meet Joseph's attack with one of her own, and she just happened to have an attack that might be potent enough to do the job of defending her while still winning her the match. Jo shored up her aura and held her hands out in front of her, palms forward. She sent waves of her volatile shadow soul down past her palms, willing it into a single point. It folded in on itself, forming a swirling orb, spinning so violently that it shook the earth beneath Jo's feet and churned the air around her into a wispy vortex. It swelled to the size of a golf ball, then a tennis ball, and finally a basketball. With each increase in size, Jo squeezed more and more of her energy into it, and its effect on the environment around her multiplied. Energy from the charging of the two attacks clashed. Bolts of plasma lanced off of both opponents, causing the very air to sizzle as if on fire. The path of the clouds above Joseph widened until they circled Jo as well, and they grew more dense and spun even faster. The air between and around the two fighters churned so fast and so hard that chunks of dirt and rock began to break free of the ground, rising up into the air, getting caught in the vortex, only to be hit by the stray energy of the charging attacks and vaporized. "Take this," Joseph called. "My air wave!" He brought his hands, still holding all of that energy, around in front of him and thrust that energy at Jo. It erupted in the form of a thick beam of soul-charged plasma, so volatile and so violent that it pushed Jo's aura back before it was even anywhere near her. As the attack bore down on her, Jo drew back her right hand. Her attack, the orb of swirling soul that she had created, followed her gesture as she wound up and made a throwing motion, launching it at the crest of Joseph's blast with a cry of, "Soul Breaker!" The attacks smacked into each other so hard that it created a shockwave that ripped the ground apart beneath them. Both fighters bore down, sending more of their soul out into their attacks, each of them willing their attack forward, each of them willing their attack to overcome the other. As brilliant and as potent as Joseph's attack was, though, Jo's happened to be particularly suited to defeating it. After clashing for a few seconds, the rotation of the Soul Breaker began to scatter the energy of the mighty beam. With a desperate cry and one final push, Jo willed her blast forward along the length of the other attack, splitting it down the middle and dispersing it harmlessly. Realizing what was about to happen, Joseph abandoned his attack, reaching out and catching the Soul Breaker, sending the entirety of his aura against it. He grit his teeth, giving the defense all that he had, finally deflecting the blast up and over his head, sending it spiraling into the sky. As he did, though, while he was still winded and most of his aura was still being held out in front of him, Jo appeared in the air behind his back. She had shadow-stepped straight up, turning in midair and delivering an axe kick to her opponent's back that was so powerful that it sent him crashing into the ground like a wayward meteor. His aura of air soul cushioned him, but it wasn't quite enough. Jo watched that aura fade as Joseph himself faded from consciousness. Jo dropped heavily to the ground, stumbling. Her own aura collapsed as she fell, exhausted, into a hard sit. She gulped down several lungfuls of air, catching her breath, then flashed Joseph a satisfied smile. Just as Joseph himself started to stir, rolling onto his back, Jo collapsed onto her back as well, hoping that she could avoid moving for a while. Unfortunately, Jo's hopes were dashed pretty quickly when Wilson returned from wherever he had been. He went to Jo first, standing over her, poking her with his cane, while she did her best to pretend that she wasn't there. "That was quite the impressive fight, Miss Seeger," he said. "But we do still have somewhere to be. Put up your healing aura and get back to your feet, please." She rolled her eyes and declared, "I'ma smack you right in the head." Despite her frustration, though, she willed her energies to mix again and was surrounded by a churning aura of golden light. It was difficult, straining her remaining stamina, but only for a short few seconds before the aura started to return that stamina to her, even as her wounds began to heal. She sat up, collecting herself, and then stood, stretching uncomfortably. Meanwhile, even though he lacked Jo's healing aid, Joseph did the same, rising far more slowly. He stumbled over to stand by Jo, gesturing at the golden aura which surrounded her, asking, "Is that some healing technique?" "Yeah," Jo replied, "but it's not easy to teach." "Oh, that's okay," Joseph told her. "I wasn't asking you to teach me. I was just curious. Nathan knows a little bit of healing anyway." As he spoke, he nodded at something behind Jo and her teacher. They turned to see the remaining Team Dueling Hearts and Team Shonen members, all in various states of recovery, walking towards them. The Dueling Hearts looked better off and less disappointed, making their collective victory obvious to the team leaders. Joseph groaned, disappointed, but then he grinned. Like Jo, he'd had a good time, and at the end of the day, that's all he actually cared about. "Man," he told Jo, surveying the area around them, at all of the collateral damage that they'd caused merely by having their fight here. "You guys live up to the hype. And you," Jo assured him, "could have beaten Christopher. I don't know that you would have for sure, but you definitely could have. And based on the state of my friends, I think the rest of your team would have done well against his." Joseph didn't thank her for her words, but his expression made clear that he was appreciative. Instead, he shook Jo's hand, gesturing for his friends to come with him, and said, "I'll let you guys get back to what you were doing. But hey, Jo," he puffed out his chest and ran his hand through his hair nervously. "I was wondering, you're really impressive. Did you want to maybe hang out together sometime? Maybe see a movie or something?" "Yeah," she said happily, and gave him her phone number. He was ecstatic, and Jo had absolutely no idea why. Sarah had to explain it to her later, and even though she did take him up on the invitation anyway, nothing came of it. Still, any awkwardness aside, the meeting of the two pro teams built a lasting rivalry between them. Both groups were made better by the encounter, and they parted company on good terms. It was unfortunate, then, that any good spirits that had come upon the Dueling Hearts vanished completely when, once Team Shonen had left them behind, Wilson turned to them and asked, "All right, so which one of you is carrying my new fridge back to the dojo?"